To the architect, an empty blueprint represents a world of possibilities.
I give and bequeath to my grandnephew all of my right, title, and interest in the house and land which I own near Mount Holly.
A world of dreams and doorways.
The above provision is contingent on discovering the location of the 46th room of my 45-room estate.
I suspect you wish me to look into your future.
Should my grandnephew fail, then this gift shall lapse.
Tonda, welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook.
Thanks for having me.
It's great chatting to you. I think I'm in day 10 so far.
Okay.
And I don't know how, but every time I dive back into the manor, into the estate, I feel like I've unlocked another 100 days worth of puzzle solving and mystery uncovering and detective work ahead of me. This labyrinthian estate just keeps unfolding before me. So congratulations on an achievement, and of course on launch and the reputation. I started hearing about blueprints I think in the lead up maybe to Next Fest. It was David Martinez from Raw Fury tweeted something or skeeted something like, "You aren't ready for this game," or something like that.
Yeah,
and
that was
it caught my attention. So congratulations.
Yeah, we were in the June Next Fest of last year, which was a big chunk before the release.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because when did you release? When was it? Was
April 10th.
April 10th.
So yeah, just about a month ago.
Wow! Congrats. How you feeling?
Oh, pretty good. I'm now pretty much recovered. I think like I definitely felt like I crossed the finish line and sort of like in sort of like a glorious fashion of like just a flaming ball of exhaustion. And so I pretty much had to like that was like after a release, that was when I was like just catching up on sleep for like what felt like the entire month.
Yeah.
And now I feel like finally starting to feel normal again.
Did you have? I mean, we're going to get into this, but just because we're on the topic, like towards the end there, did you have support in closing it out, or was it kind of just you in the trenches? Is the team just you? Do you have a few other people on board?
Yeah. Well, so Fury Studios, which is sort of the development arm of Raw Fury's sister company, they assisted all with optimization and porting, and so a lot of the final stuff was more so a lot of them doing a lot of the work for the final stages, and I was just I was trying to squeeze in as many bug fixes as I could. But knowing like, okay, we're already past, sort of like the release candidate and the gold master. And so, there was a lot of back and forth as like, I'm trying to get a lot more stuff in, but like, is there going to be enough time to even properly QA all these fixes I'm doing? And I'm thinking, you have to weigh like, well, some of this I'm fixing is pretty critical stuff. So this might be worth, risking it before the QA, even though it doesn't have as much time as the release candidate. So, I think throughout a lot of the development, it was me. But this last year has been a bigger team because I was collaborating with, them doing the Xbox and PlayStation ports and a lot of just final people kind of like getting on hiring on in this last year to kind of help wrap it up.
Yeah, those worldwide sim ship releases, they're quite a logistical undertaking for sure. And look, I'm playing on Xbox and it's silky smooth. So shout out Fury Studios, amazing stuff. Congrats again on getting it over the line. All right, well, let's take it back to where we usually do all the time on this
Okay.
podcast. Tonda, you have a really, from what I have read in my research for this podcast, you have a really interesting way of how you've come about to blueprints and how the game has come about and everything. So I'm really excited to dig in to this and hear it straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. But let's start off by going all the way back. What is your first memory of video games in your life? And not just the one of like the first time you spotted a video game or played a video game, but was there a particular one that kind of, you would say was the inciting incident that put you on this collision course with blueprints, or, set your brain on fire for the possibility of them, or inspired you in any way?
It's interesting because I feel like probably for every dev, there's two sort of inciting incidents. There's that first sort of time you become a gamer, in that you fall in love with games, and you've got to say that's really got to be the actual inciting incident that puts you on a development path eventually, because I feel like I would guess for 99.9%, you're gonna fall in love with games as a medium first, and then eventually there'll be maybe a second inciting incident that actually triggers you wanting to bust out the paintbrush yourself and try to create something. So I think there's a couple key ones. I will say that one of my first actual experiences with a game, and it's like so young that I hardly even understood that it was necessarily a game versus a software, and this has to be something for MS-DOS. It was called Beast, and it's like an entire sort of like ASCII text base where you're like control these H's or rather you don't control an H, you're basically controlling like a asterisk or something, and you're being chased by these H's that are beasts in a sort of labyrinthian. The graphics reminded me of ZZT, which I kind of like graduated into, and that was when I first started getting into development. So I actually started developing really early on, like even like in the Windows, like prior to Windows 95. So like in the DOS era of ZZT, and then going to QBasic, and then I sort of stopped. That was just me kind of dabbling in very young childhood. I must have been 11 or 12.
Yeah, just tinkering.
Just tinkering, and it was a pretty basic thing, and then just learning a bit of QBasic, and then later basic. I think it was basic 83 for the TI-83 calculator in high school, and just literally just tinkering around and creating a few games like that.
Yeah, hell yeah. The graphics calculator was the preferred distribution platform of high school students for many years there, for sure.
Yeah, and it was like a pretty easy way to, I mean, it was all peer-to-peer, passing of the files. And I think everything was entirely calculator to calculator. I don't think I ever figured out how to like connect the calculator to a computer in those times, because everything was kind of like getting, like, files were all on floppies and stuff. So I never figured out. So all the things I created at that time are kind of lost to the abyss.
Yeah.
I would love to check them out one day.
Yeah, right. Bust them out, dust them off, get the get the graphics calculator booted up. And so, was your family household like, or the situation that you grew up in? Was it kind of like a tech savvy household? Was it just you? Were you the black sheep of the family, coding in a corner over here, or was there an influence from a cousin or something like that? What was the sort of game playing environment?
No, so I think like I remember we had a PC, and I felt like at that time this would have been. I feel like we had a PC probably by 1990.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was like 6 years old, 7 years old at the time. Um, and so this was just, it was, I don't think it even had Windows on it at the time. So this was just a pure, MS-DOS, based, thing that ran on floppy disks and getting games. So they had to be tech savvy enough to want to get this. And I think perhaps my dad got one in some capacity for some of his work. I know they had they had one of those old, I want to call them digital typewriters. They
Mhm.
they have like this very small display that flips up.
Yes,
So
yes. Oh my god, I'd forgot they existed. Yes,
yeah, so that was
a
like
a word processor out a
yeah,
Clavier.
word processor. So it was like a very
Yeah.
small window of that, and I think that like they just got a PC maybe to just have more real estate to see the text rather than that thin strip where you could only see like 3 or 4 lines
Yeah.
at a time. So they probably got it for the work, and that kind of sufficed for a while. And I actually have a good story about how I actually got them to upgrade, which was so. And this is probably the answer. This is probably the real answer to your question, because
Amazing.
while Beast and some of these MS DOS games and QBasic games were kind of my first, that was like my first exposure.
The
That wasn't
awakening, so to speak.
yeah, that wasn't really what sort of like set the fire.
Hmm.
And what set the fire was I had gotten an NES, and I was not allowed. My grandfather gave me an NES for Christmas. And I guess maybe due to some media articles that had been written or something, my parents weren't comfortable with the NES coming into the house. So whether they were tech savvy or not, they were definitely scared of maybe some things they had read about maybe how addictive this new medium was, or the ramifications that it might have on kids, as opposed to like going outside and playing and stuff. So
Hmm.
for whatever reason, their logic was, and I was perhaps too young to understand it at the time, but
Yeah.
the NES had to stay at my grandfather's apartment.
Oh wow.
Um, and so, I remember he was in a big apartment complex. He was, you know, in his 60s.
Hmm.
But going
And the
over,
rooms changed every time you went. It was a whole
yeah,
thing.
going over there and playing the NES and exploring these worlds. That just became such a joyful activity. And if their reasoning to do it was to get, to get more visitations
Yeah,
for my grandfather, I mean, maybe that
it
was part
worked.
of the logic. But at some point I begged for them to return it
Yeah.
home.
Okay.
Fast forward a couple years later, um, obviously I started hearing obviously all the word on the street about the Super. And
Mm.
so um, I never got a Super. And so it was a lot of hearing about friends talk about it and hearing friends talk about Super Mario, and I guess Super Mario World, and wanting to go over and check that out. And so I had one friend who had a Super and Super Mario World. I believe that was the only game he had. And so I was really excited to go over to his house for a sleepover. And his name was Tyler. And so I went over to his house, and we played the Super. We looked at like some Nintendo powers of like upcoming games like past the sort of launch window and stuff. And this was a little bit after the Super had come out, so he might have
Mm.
had another game, but we were pretty much focusing on Super Mario World, because that was just kind of blowing my mind, like how much graphical fidelity
Yeah.
over the NES had, and it had like this parallaxing of
Yeah.
the backgrounds and all this cool stuff. Um, and so how this story goes is I was just kind of like absolutely blown away by the graphics, and he said, uh, if you think this is cool, do you want to see something? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, follow me. And so we went up the stairs because we were kind of like downstairs in the sort of like recreation room type thing with the TV. We went upstairs down a long hallway and we went into an office. And it was like a dark, dimly lit office. And on maybe his father's desk, because I guess he worked at home, was a personal computer. And booted it up and showed me Myst.
Oh wow.
And let's just say that's the reason I never got a Super. Because when I went back home, I did not beg my parents, I need to get the Super Nintendo. I was like, we need to get a computer with a CD-ROM drive. I think the experience of just immediately the atmospheric presence, the wind, the water, it was immersive in a way that I had never experienced. And especially playing in that dimly dark room and just exploring the island and not really understanding anything. And it was like, that became probably from that point, which was, I guess that was 1993. Probably for the next, 7 years, that just became everything for me.
I think it's also hard to, maybe it's worth illustrating for our listeners here as well, who maybe weren't around. They were too young. They're now adult professionals, but they weren't around at that point in time when Myst came out, or online enough to be playing those sorts of games. But the differential between like literally what you did in the recreational room and then going from like the real-time graphics of the day, you say on a console or even on a PC, and then the pre-rendered environments or the pre-rendered graphics. Even I remember, the cutscenes in like a Final Fantasy or something, like the gap was so vast between those two. And it's like, now it's to the point where we don't even have pre-rendered cutscenes pretty much in video games, or pre-rendered artwork in a lot of games, because they're one-to-one. But I can imagine, like, especially as a kid, like going from the real-time graphics and then being shown this, this PC pre-rendered graphics, especially of Myst too, which still to this day is like, has a kind of presence, like you say.
It was even if you had been familiar with the predecessors, which I wasn't. I don't think I had ever actually seen 3D before in any capacity. And so I hadn't played any of those sort of predecessor games that Myst just jumped the graphical fidelity by probably 5 years. I mean, it was just so much more ahead of its time. And that was a cool thing. It was cool because this, practically, I haven't looked up the date, but practically the SNES and Myst kind of dropped together. So this wasn't like further along in that 16-bit. I was basically going from 8-bit to Myst. I just had one session with 16-bit in between there, but it was a big jump, and for me it was more just the sound design. Like I just think it was like it was playing something in a way that I wouldn't necessarily experience. I think eventually on the Super, there were some of those more atmospheric, immersive things like Another World or Out of This World. I always mess up that title, but the Another World, I think,
Another
the platformer,
World,
Another World with the platformer with the that had the same sort of ambience in the atmosphere, and so that's really what attracted to me. And that kind of at that point over, I kind of was a PC gamer for many years until PlayStation.
And was it the kind of gameplay format as well that spoke to you as well the ambience? Like, was the puzzle side of things and the mystery something that really
and the story and like how much of that was sort of environmental storytelling. It wasn't really explained to you. It wasn't an active narrative. It was more of you piecing together. It was more of you piecing together like how this world works. And everything beside it. So it was all of that, and it sparked me trying to sort of chase chase that high, and I played so many Myst clones in the interim between Myst and Riven, just trying to recapture that. I'm sure a lot of them are beloved by the community, but none of them worked for me in the same way. I have some pet favorites, but they're all kind of quirky, like Atlantis, Lost Tales, and Lighthouse, the Dark Being, and they're fun, but they aren't Myst. So
Yeah. It's funny how we can experience a game, especially in those young ages, and then you find yourself like chasing that high for quite a long time. It like hits you in a particular way or something, and you're just looking for something that's going to do it. I remember, funnily enough, you were talking about Myst coming out around the same time as a console, but interestingly, something that came out at the same time as was Doom. So Doom came out in 93 and Myst came out in 93. One of the best conversations I've ever been privileged enough to bear witness to was at NYU. They used to, I'm not sure if they do it still, but at NYU Game Center, they used to have this series where once a month or something, they would come in and have people do talks, like whoever was in town in New York, some game developer or whatever. And they had Rand Miller and John Romero giving a talk on Myst and Doom and coming out in the same year and that kind of era. And it was just absolutely phenomenal to see these two developers that had released essentially like genre defining like FPS games
and both first person.
Yeah. It's really
that's really cool. Real time pre-rendered, both first person.
Yeah, one a shooter,
very different, demographics in terms of the enjoyment.
It's really cool. That's what age are you? Put a kind of age on this, Tonda, when sort of Myst first grabbed you like this. You were like 11 or something?
Yeah, I was like 10, 9 or 10.
Cool. And so then like you said, you went and played a bunch of other games. You're now a PC gamer, but you had said that you sort of stopped developing a bit. What about your teen years and video games and did you have an idea of what you wanted to be in, as a grown up or when you grow up? Was game development any part of that?
No, it was pure filmmaking. That was kind of like my passionate things. I think, even though I probably started tinkering in development a little earlier because of messing around in ZZT and QBasic, and then Basic 83 was in high school. But in that time, I was making films. So I had like a high 8 or a VHS-C camcorder. Just like one of those 90s camcorders.
The exact type,
just making film, and that was really what I was putting most of my aspirations into, and that's kind of how I envisioned in the best case scenario what my future would hold, and not really in a practical sense, because I don't think I've ever been practical. It's like, oh, this will be what I can do for a living.
You're a solo video game developer, so
I think I would always imagine I'm going to be working, at Target, or like a department store, but I'm going to be a filmmaker. I don't think I ever. I guess I was like grounded enough in my dreams to think like I'm going to have to be pursuing art in whatever capacity as my after hours hobby.
Yeah, the barman writing his screenplay on cocktail napkins, and
but I have such a ferocity and focus that there's really nothing else in my life to take up those out of work hours real estate in terms of time allotment. So that's literally what I'm doing every hour outside of that, and that kind of, so that was kind of my high school, and that kind of went to college too, where I was so obsessive with filmmaking that I just stopped going to class, and just
you didn't study film. What did you study in high school? In college.
No, I didn't make it past the general education. Yeah, I only made it about once. Yeah, cool. I made it one semester, and then sort of started prepping to move out to Hollywood to try to make a proper go of it.
Hell yeah! And so, what year was it that you sort of made the trip out to Hollywood?
It was like 2005.
Yeah. Okay. And
yeah, so 2020.
Was it Did you just
20
rock
years
up in a
ago.
car and then, purchase a
Yes,
pillow, bring a pillow from home, and you were shacked up in your car
okay,
for 6 months?
I can paint you a perfect picture. So,
Please, yeah.
so when I was in college, I
Mhm.
was like, you know what? Okay, I've got a new dream job. My dream job is going to be to work at Blockbuster, which is a video
Mhm.
rental company, the biggest. If anyone's not familiar with Blockbuster, but so I'm like, okay, I'm going to work at a video store because then I'm like around sort of what my passion is, which was movies.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll make film you know after work and like sort of surrounding my work schedule. And so when I moved out to Hollywood, I just got a transfer from one Blockbuster on the East Coast to a Blockbuster in Los Angeles. And so so that was really all I had was like, okay, pack up
Mhm.
the car. I moved out with another filmmaker who was my best friend, who's
Great.
Axel Havico, and so we just basically just moved out there just to try to take a crack at things, And I only kept working at Blockbuster for about 4 months, and then I realized, like, if I'm going to actually take a shot of breaking into any sort of actual work in cinema,
Mm.
I need to actually like make an attempt. I felt like too much of my time was being spent, sort of working the 9 to 5, and
Mm.
it was kind of really stifling how much time I had. So I think that at that point, in part just due to how expensive it was to live in Los Angeles, it was like, this is like the amount of work I have to do to do that it's like I'm never going to be able to have a real shot at this dream unless I just try to like go all in on it.
So, paint us another picture, especially for those of us who aren't American and see this on the silver screen so often, right? Like the transplant into LA, whether it be an actor or a filmmaker or trying to make a go of it. What was it like trying to get your break? You mentioned you had to throw yourself into it full time. Were you running coffees? Were you hanging out at like the local joints
Yeah,
where
so
other screenwriters were? Or
I love that you bring up this sort of thing, because I think that's a big part of it. Because I think, like, whenever I'm doing stuff, I'm more driven toward dramatic gestures and
yeah.
theatrics, and so I think a big part of it was this sort of creative dream of
Mhm.
moving out to Los Angeles. Because when you're out here, you find a lot of transplants that kind of all had this same dream, and
Yeah.
it's sort of this shared commonality, but it has a dark lining, which is 99% of these end in shattered failures.
Mm.
But I think that the dream is what's valuable.
Yeah.
I think the common idea and the courage it takes to do that, because I think for a lot of people it's very easy to remain where you are and kind of like just resign your life and your things, and it's very difficult to pack everything up, put it in a car, and just drive. It takes like a ridiculous amount of time to drive across the country.
Yeah.
It's like 40 hours.
It's like there's
But
almost something that prescribes so much more meaning to it as well. It makes it so much more of an adventure too. It was just
oh
like I'm
yeah,
just moving down to the south of the state or something. It'd be
yeah,
very
it's like a
different, yeah.
medieval journey, which is like
Yeah, to your own
gonna
Oregon
take
Trail,
months.
really. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and it feels like that. And it felt like that to me, and I feel like it was the first time I'd ever sort of like struck out on my own, because I went to
Mm.
college very close, very close to my hometown. So like this was kind of like my first time ever, taking a shot and getting there. And so normally there's two ways you can go. One, you can get a role, like you said, running coffees, like kind of get a production assistant role on maybe bigger projects and kind of work your way up from there.
Mhm.
Your other way is to start in a more creative capacity or like a higher role thing, but work on smaller projects.
Yes.
And I just felt like that was going to be, I had already, probably made like, 40 or 50 short films.
Oh, wow.
So I felt pretty well versed. I had a pretty good reel. So I pretty much just started as a cinematographer,
Yeah,
just
incredible.
because using footage from my own films and then just trying to look for projects that were looking to hire director of photographies, directors of photography, and just trying to pitch myself into the ring with no experience. And it didn't take me long, just by working very, very low paying sort of gigs for other filmmakers' short films, right? So this is kind of the two strategies being: one, work on a big movie in a very running coffee capacity, or work on a very small project in a higher role. And in my case, it was DP. So at that point, then you're not escalating your position, you're escalating the size of your project.
Yes,
and so
of
you
course.
make short film, then maybe you can take a shot at like a more low budget TV pilot. And then from there, you're just making connections. And as long as you're continuing to do work, and I guess, make sort of more connections, than when people that you worked on in a film, when they start to blow up and they get more resources, or they get funding for a project, then perhaps then they'll think of you. And so kind of worked my way up. Eventually started shooting music videos.
Yeah, cool.
And then that was my first time directing, was when I was then started pitching to actually direct music videos.
Okay.
So I did a couple of those, and then very quickly from there, the scale of the music videos went up, and then I started directing commercials.
Oh, right.
And that's when
Where the money
I
is,
started.
right? That's when it first
that
become a
that is
stable
exactly.
income.
It's like, so you have to give up sort of your creative dreams in order to that. I mean, there's still creative work to be done, but a lot of it is kind of like soulless.
Yeah, that's it. It's like do a short film, get your creative, collaborations going on, do a music video with some really inspiring artist, and then do your Bank of America ad and pay the bills for a month and a half, right?
And a lot of that is like, they're creative, but the vision isn't yours; it's the ad agency's, right? So you are literally an instrument to try to realize their vision. And that's basically it. So then I started DocuBomb in 2013. And that was just as a vehicle to handle, commercial clients and do our own things. Yeah.
Cool.
So that is pretty much that is pretty much my escalation. I wanted to make movies, wound up in the commercial field, which is not where I wanted to be, which led to my exit 3 years after that. So
yeah. Let's my partner is actually a production designer in film and TV, and she's like, so all of this is literally a mirror with like the life that I see her going through, is that she just came off a feature as a production designer, and now she's like, and then she was on a TV show for a little bit, but as a dresser, because there wasn't a production design gig. And so, especially in the art department, you're moving around up and down, and
100%.
And now she's like, oh, should I just take some time and, actually like do some commercials, or like do some shorter form things to just get some cash up and some stability, and then try for another long form thing. It's so incredible watching like this deft navigation, and like it's part like you say, philosophically, like, what do I want to be? What do I believe in as an artist? How do I want to express myself? But then balanced with like, and it's not just like, oh, I'll take the easy option and go this way. It's then, can I even get the work, and how do I get the commercial work and get to that point?
It's hard to describe people, because like these are creative fields that are almost entirely, structured around freelance, like people that are effectively self-employed, because they're just going from one gig to another. And I think this is why you can see, like these in this search for sustainability, why like TV shows, why everyone loves TV shows in the industry, because you really, this is finally something that might be stable for a couple years, depending on how successful and how many seasons there are. Otherwise, you're constantly looking for work, and that's gonna take at least half of your time. And even when for me, when I finally was like had my own production company and stuff, so much of that is spent just talking to potential new clients, and so much meeting. And for me, it's like all that logistical stuff. You just want to be in that creative mode of like on the set, and it's all that in between stuff that it's just hard to do.
And it's the tragic irony that like most creatives, the creative geniuses naturally aren't the administrative like boffins as well, right? So
yeah. I had inadvertently wormed my way into a position I did not want to be in, we'll say, which was doing administrative stuff and doing work for agencies and stuff.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a perfect segue.
Met a lot of cool people doing it. Met a lot of cool people doing
that's
it.
one thing I'm jealous of watching her. Like I love the people that I work with. Like the League of Geeks crew are some of the coolest, best people I've ever worked with. But like Tiff, my partner, gets to change the people she works with. It's like a random lottery every 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes even shorter. And like it's the people that come in and out of her life, like creatively, and the friends that she makes, and professional, and then of course the nemesis that come along every so often. Right? It's really interesting. It's such a tapestry of like human beings that are weaving their way through her life.
Yeah, it's a crazy industry. Looking at almost any other industry, there's very little comparisons, right? It's kind of a unique unto itself.
So now let's talk about, you mentioned your exit from the industry. You got to the commercials, you're getting, commercial work and everything. And then you've spoke of an exit from film. Like, talk to me about the things that we've probably touched on a couple of these themes in what we've just been talking about, but what were the things that kind of pushed you in a different direction? What was that direction? And when did you know that it was time to make that leap, and how did you?
So this was in 2016, or at the very beginning of 2016, maybe the end of 2015. I had a moment, and in this moment I can remember clear. There was a moment, perhaps I was thinking about these old, TI-83 games and stuff I had done. And so on the side, we haven't talked about, I kind of dabble in web development.
Oh, cool.
This is just another hobby. And so I had been running a site for Magic the Gathering cards. And so I had been learning a lot of JavaScript and CSS in order to create this site. Normally, historically, I've been raw HTML. That was what I used in the 90s to make sites. I always use tables. I still use tables. And, I just put HTML elements in these tables, put images, and, have no margins in my tables so that all the images are seamless. And that's how I do my buttons. If you look at any of my stuff, I do it the same way. But I had finally been learning JavaScript. So I had just created like my first JavaScript game. It was just one file, one HTML file, one JavaScript file. And it was like kind of had some, dice rolling Yahtzee mechanics mixed with like mining up different colored gems. It was just something very, something very simple and cool. But it was like kind of like, it was the first time I had kind of put my feet back in the water and since like, I was like 13.
Wow. And did it feel good stretching those old muscles?
Yeah, well, it was cool. It was like, okay, like this is just fun doing it. And I think like web development always felt like tangible to me, where like video game production always felt like this is something similar a lot of people have with movies too, is like, this is something that you need a lot of experience with. You need a lot of technology, we'll say on the post-production side, right? because before Apple sort of dropped their Final Cut Pro and things, like Avid was like, like a $2,000 software, right? Like this is something that is not necessarily accessible to people. And I felt the same thing with actual video production because, reading about, all these sort of people developing their own engines, like Square Enix, developing like the Crystal engine and stuff. So like, I'm just picturing like the barrier to entry is so unfathomably out of reach that like, this isn't even worth entertaining or even exploring. And I think that kind of changed, around that time, 2013 to 2016, when I was finally seeing like the first indie games. Obviously, indie games have existed for a long time before that, but that was like the first sort of mega success indie games. And it's funny because like back in the Romero days, like every game was actually indie, but like you just by the time we get to 2016, then there's a huge differential. And
course.
So talking about games, like Limbo and Gone Home and Braid. And so I think that was the first time where I realized these are individuals making games, or smaller teams. And this is not necessarily, this might be worth checking out. Like this might just be worth looking into. And so I remember I had made like a post in a forums, which was like, hey, I'm kind of curious to explore game dev. Is there any software you would recommend me checking out? And I think I remember there's something like, there's something with air. There was a software with air in the word. That I was kind of exploring, and it might have been like Apple Air or Mac Air on the Mac side. Right. And I was kind of checking out, and someone was like, "Oh yeah, check out Unity. Like you can, it's pretty easy to get started. And just check it out." So I had some random forum comment with someone telling me to check out this software, and I remember thinking, and this is a very clear thought. I remember thinking, man, I wish I had spent the last 10 years doing this, where it's like, I feel like it's too late to get started. It's like I had this sample, but the filmmaking was such a wide thing. Now, of course, I wouldn't be thinking this if I had actually wound up where I wanted to be, which was, making movies instead of working for agencies. Yeah. But given where I am, it's like, man, I wish I had done it, because it feels like I'm so much more past. I've now just hit 30. I was 30 years old, and I was thinking like if I had done this out of high school, because that's why I had started coding at age 13, and so it's like, oh, letting this go, like where would my talent have been if I hadn't let that go? And then I remember thinking, there's a million reasons why not to do something. And this is sounding very much like me telling myself, you missed your opportunity. Yeah. But it's never ever too late to start.
Although ironically, in your early 30s, I find myself included, a lot of people, when you're in your early 30s, you're like, oh, it's too late. It's too late for me. Yeah. I've got no time left.
And then obviously it's like ridiculous.
You're a baby.
And I feel like that stage, that mentality is just always going to escalate, right? There's always, there's always a recontextualization of your life. And how and the metrics of distance in your life are continually getting recontextualized every 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think I figured that out, because I remember thinking like, you know what, like there's really like, I'll just start now.
Yeah.
I'll just start now. And so I wasn't thinking like I was going to abandon like my production company at the time, certainly, because I felt like I had finally grown that to a successful level. But I did download Unity, and I was like, okay, let's just check it out. Let's see how easy this is to make something, because this had always felt like super daunting, and super that. And I would say within the first day, I did like one of the basic like Unity tutorials, which is like creating like a rigid body rolling ball that goes around and collects coins. It's the very first Unity tutorial, at least it was 10 years ago. So if anyone learned Unity back then, they'll probably know what I'm talking about. So I did that very first one, and I was like, that's cool. And then I just immediately went off book and took that concept, and I downloaded a first person controller, and I was like, okay, like this, like if I'm doing first person, I don't need to deal with character animation. I don't need to deal with anything. It's literally, something, a package you can just download from Unity and either in the asset store or just within whatever package management system they had 8 years ago. And just within, I would say probably 24 hours, I felt like I was off to the races, and I felt like this is going to be way easier than I thought it was going to be. Like a tremendous amount easier than I had been imagining. And I feel like the barrier to entry in terms of knowing a coding language that was actually applicable, because I feel like all my languages are just web languages at this point, and whatever memories I had of QBasic and Basic 83 were long gone. So I felt like I'm purely starting from scratch. I don't know anything, and yeah, this thing's just moving super fast.
That must have been a fantastic feeling.
Yeah, and within 3 months, I had a working prototype of Blueprints.
Wow.
And so, and not just a prototype, I would say, well, practically the full game.
Wow, like a full blown vertical slice proof of concept.
I mean, like not even a slice. It was like you could find the goal was to find room 46. You could find room 46. The way you found it is very similar to the current one. There was just less depth, but it was in less rooms. But the actual gameplay, if you go back and you play the 2016 version, it's going to be very similar to playing like the first 10 days.
Amazing.
Like it's going to be very similar. So at that point, I was all in. Like, just like I was like, okay, like this not only if this was if my idea was like, let's check out this technology, see how accessible it was. I feel like the results were so much better than my wildest dreams. So if I had
anyone's wildest dreams, it's like, let's just play around for a bit and see what this thing's got. Oh, I made a video game. Okay, right.
Yeah. So I feel like if I had an inkling that I might want to do this was like getting like a 20-fold confirmation of what it would have taken me to gone into this. So at that point, I just decided I'm going to shut down the production company. And I believe what I did was in 2017, I did more work in commercials than I had done prior to that. I was like, I need to try to get as much funds as I possibly can to try to pay for the production of the game. And so that was what I did. And basically then at 2017, that was the only year in this process that I was working on the game part-time.
Wow.
So the first 3 months were full-time, and then everything else after that was full-time.
So let's pause there, because now I can feel the momentum like a slingshot being drawn back about you flying through from 2017 now to 2025, where we're at. But I think it's a good time to take a break and actually pause for a moment for our listeners who actually have maybe heard about Blueprints and, all of the chatter on the internet about this game and the hype behind it, but maybe don't know what it is. So if you could, I'm sure you've done it a number of times now, you're probably well practiced at it. But for our listeners, maybe give them the elevator pitch about what Blueprints is.
Cool. Blueprints is an architectural adventure game. It's a mix of mystery, strategy, and puzzle genres. I didn't really create it with any genres in mind, so it doesn't really fit neatly into any one box. but it is a game in which you are exploring a mansion that changes every single day. And so you will, every door you approach, you'll be given a choice of 3 different rooms. And at its core, that is what Blueprints is. And I feel like that's usually how I like to describe it, just that simply, is if you can imagine if every door is possibly one of 3 rooms, then you just make a choice and you just progress along kind of creating a mansion as you are exploring it. But it has elements of first person sort of adventure games like Myst and Riven, and it has elements of strategy games, more like strategy board games. Most of the mechanical design is actually from the board game side of things. But yeah, that's how I would describe it.
Yeah. It's really amazing, even, when we talk about the moment-to-moment gameplay of Blueprints, just the gameplay that is in regards to like a decision space and the depth and kind of meat of gameplay that is provided just by those 3 options that you get whenever you press on a door. And I think it's worth as well stating for our listeners who haven't played the game or aren't familiar with it, those 3 options change with every door. It's like hands of a hand of cards. Each one is sort of drawn. 3 different options are drawn from a pool of rooms. And it's just, I was playing last night and I was my partner, because I was hogging the TV. I'm like, I got this interview, I got to play this game. And she's like, I want to watch whatever she wanted to watch. And she was watching me. She's like, are you still choosing what room to pick? I'd been like looking at this for like 10 minutes trying to decide between the library or the conservatory. And yeah, it just provides such a chunky decision space just in that one, literally the one interaction in the game is so deep.
Yeah. And I think that at its core, I mean, I knew that when I first come up with that concept and that concept came from, the word drafting, of like wanting to incorporate architectural drafting with, sort of the board game, card game concept of drafting cards. And I knew that was really cool. Just choosing between one of 3 rooms, and then everything else in the game kind of became, how do we make the decision interesting for each door, and how do we continually change players' evaluations of what's good? Because it's very easy to think balancing means making all these rooms, the exact same usefulness in terms of utility or resources. Because then it's like, then you have an interesting decision when all 3 are the exact same power level. But like I think it's more interesting when they're not the same power level, but there's situations in which you might be willing to draft a lavatory, even though you thought there would be no world in which I would ever want to draft this room. And then eventually through strategy, you can learn there are these situations. But it's cool to be able to have those evaluations of the rooms continually shift and change based on what based on the positioning, based on other elements of that day.
Yeah, there was a room that I remember, later in the game and we're gonna strive for a no spoiler podcast here, but like, there's a room where you can see stats of your game, right? And what's happened. And there was one where it's like, it says the room that you drafted the least. And it was like, maybe someday or whatever, you'll draft this room. And I was like, yeah, I never drafted that room. And I've seen it come up a number of times. And then it was a few runs later that it came up and I was like, oh, that's actually exactly what I need right now. Like and so it had gone from I'd been through like 6 runs or something, and every time just tossed this room to the side whenever it came up in the drafting options in the drafting pool. And then one time I like leapt onto it basically because when it came up, because of that, like you say, that subjective variation in the context in whatever you whichever way and whichever context you find these rooms options. So let's take it right back to the seed of Blueprints, because as you say, it kind of defies, obviously there are some genres that people can sort of, align it to or try and move it closer to those posts, but it does kind of defy genre in a way. Like it has its feet in a number of different camps. How did the concept come about? What was the seed of inspiration for Blueprints? Was it a film you'd been wanting to make, or because it's got also quite a deep narrative and history and everying that you're unraveling as you're going through the manner?
All that side came in later. It did start in a very mechanical sense. And it started, I think I had a couple pages I have a notebook that it just has an ideas, and the ideas might be for a short film or they might be for a board game. And I do a lot of sort of board game designs for my friends. You know, I haven't published anything in the tabletop space. But I think for a long time, I just consider the stuff being done in board games design wise to be just very much closer to my taste than what was being done in video games. I feel like video games have kind of shifted to sort of like a more percentage based, you know, sort of, and a lot of times over complex systems that are kind of hiding a lack of gameplay by just trying to throw a lot of like polish and glamour. And I think that you can really see this when you're looking at like an older RPG, or let's say a JRPG system, like one of the original Final Fantasies, you know, versus the new ones, which is like, you're not really doing much. You're just showing like a lot of fancy animations and these abilities seem like they're doing something. But man, if you ever look at a Euro game and you see like these simple resources, like, okay, now we're talking, like this is something. And to me, it's night and day, like playing these two types of things. And that's like forever. I was like,
there's a chunkiness, right, that's lost in video games that is like in regards to the design concepts. There's a granularity in video games that kind of has watered them down almost to a degree that tabletop games don't have the privilege of actually utilizing or even going into, and so they retain this sort of design chunkiness.
Yeah, and I think I love that, because I think anything I would love is like a small enough amount of resources that you can actually tangibly wrap your head around them, you know, and you can kind of have ownership over these things all at the same time. So I do think I like, you know, 4 or 5 resources that aren't even presented to the player all at once. Maybe there's 3 primary resources. And I think if you look at this in Blueprints, we have gems, keys, and coins. And these are primarily this. Now, obviously, steps is another resource, but we even put that in a different corner so that players can kind of like compartmentalize that thing in a different part of their brain. But you can really see the resources, the primary 3 being gems, coins, and keys. And I feel like that is the level of simplicity that I love. And I am guilty in my board game taste. If you look at Board Game Geek, I kind of tend to like games between 1 and 2 complexity ratings. That's just my own taste. I like things that are very simple to understand, but have, you know, sort of like a depth of strategy and a complexity to them. And then I just love sort of like the transparency of board game. Like if you look at a board game card, like what it does just seems so much more transparent to me coming from a tabletop space, because it's up to the players to have to resolve this rather than the game system resolving it, you know, unbeknownst to you, which lets them do all sorts of stuff. So I do like the transparency of simple effects. And I think if you look at the floor plans in Blueprints, you can kind of see where I sort of lean toward in terms of game design, because, you know, it'd be very easy to have a lot of rooms with very complex effects. And I feel like we've done a pretty good job of, you know, kind of really showing some self-restraint in the design space. Because for me, opening a door and having a room with 3 doors that does nothing, or a room with 1 door that gives you 4 coins, and then maybe a 1 room with a simple effect. And I think that to me is a really interesting choice. And it's a choice that,
just while we're in it, let's take a little deep dive into this. Do you have a memory or a moment of something that was like a degree of complexity that maybe even you put in the game and then decided to remove, or you were really keen on or excited about, but ultimately decided against it to retain this kind of simplicity or chunkiness, or to not expand the complexity of the game?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think when you look at card games, I think like when card games have, I'm really intrigued by vanilla cards in card games.
Mm.
And for people that might not know, vanilla cards are maybe cards that lack any text whatsoever. They maybe have one feature, but they are like the most simple things possible. Like for maybe like in a card game with creatures, maybe the creatures have some, like a power or an attack number, but they don't actually have any other abilities, and other cards do. And I think I'm always intrigued by what purpose they serve in the design, because it's very easy to over design every single card in your game. And especially talking about board games here, where it's very easy to have everything have a sort of weightiness and a complex, because, each of these cards are really interesting. But if you took a game and let's use Magic as an example, if every card had the complexity of a rare card, because they limit their complexity only toward the higher rarities, and all the common cards are very simple designs, then like you have a very difficult game to learn. And for me, a game that I enjoy slightly less. I think that's like why in Magic I basically only play limited, because I like to play with these simpler card effects and simpler things, and kind of working around what you're given. And the fact that vanilla cards exist at all is really, has always sort of appealed to me, in terms of just like why does that work, and what purpose could that serve in terms of the overall design thing. So if you look at my very first design file, which was the first thing created for the game, which was just a list of maybe 40 to 50 rooms, that I kind of just designed in a vacuum without having touched the Unity side of the code or anything. This was kind of when I was more thinking this might be a board game. But there was already from that time several rooms that had no text on them whatsoever, and very, very few that even had more than 6 or 7 words. So I think just due to my own design style, I'm always going to be pushing that complexity down. So I don't think I ever had to scale back complexity, like you were saying. If anything, it was more of like I would come up with an idea that would require a lot more text for a card,
Yes,
or a room. But I feel like, I've kind of earned it at this point, because I'm so restrained that I am free when I think of a cool idea to explore it, because I'm not risking overburdening the core system. If anything, like, it could use some extra elements.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I'd never actually thought about that. The notion that the hyper restraint at the beginning of development, and when you're finding and establishing your design space, even as you're moving midway through it towards the end, that you provide yourself with so much negative space to then integrate complexity later on in the game when you have a better understanding of it and ideas are coming to you. It's like you get those freebies, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think Blueprints pretty much demonstrates that pretty well, because if anyone's gone deeper into the game, they can understand how these systems add up. So
yes,
even having you have to have this simplicity for this game to even work, because could you even imagine if every room actually had so much text on it? When you have 40 of these effects in play at once, I mean, it's impossible to even understand. So it definitely, I feel like I would have done that regardless, but when playing it, if anything, I realized, okay, I've kind of stumbled on, just by being so restrained up front, I stumbled on the correct level. So at that point, I probably did realize I probably don't want to push it too much from this point.
Yeah. It's funny, these you're talking about people who get into the later stages of the game. I remember my realizations, my like, whoa, like what the fuck moments range from something. I think I was in the first day on like room 10 or something, and I was like drafting blueprints, and then I was like, hold on a second, blueprints. Oh my god! And then in day 10 or something last night, I like hit the boiler room, and there's like, and then I won't obviously get into it, but you start realizing like these sort of layered gameplay possibilities, and I was like, what the fuck? It's just like it's ever unraveling. It's really amazing, these moments of realization that have, and I might be misquoting you here, Tonda, but I do remember seeing someone say online something about you mentioning something like gameplay or like a puzzle doesn't need to just be like what you click, like it's, and I think Blueprints is phenomenal. So many of the realizations that I've had in the Blueprints wasn't because I pressed a button and something happened. It was because maybe I saw something in a room. I'm not even like reading something. I'm just like looking at something and putting it together. Or even when a room opens up that I haven't drafted before, and then a kind of realization hits me, there is this really, I would almost say that there feels like sometimes in Blueprints, there's more gameplay, or the gameplay is revealing itself more often when I'm not interacting with things in a way than when I am. It's kind of like in my mind space, so to speak. Was that an intention? Or was that something that kind of organically happened?
No, I think it's funny because everything we were just talking about was more about like the text on the floor plan tiles themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that philosophy does translate to almost everything in the game, which is my desire to present things in a much more simple way and things. And I think that's why when people are exploring these rooms, a lot of times they're like, oh, I really expected there to be more things that you could interact with. I think that is a directly, comparable to seeing a room tile like a hallway that has no text on it and be like, oh, I expected some of these rooms to have more complex, abilities.
Functionality or something.
Yeah. And I think that it's because the game is operating at both of these levels simultaneously that, like you said, you can have a room like the boiler room, and in terms of text, it reads very simple. It just says power source. This is 2 words of text. And of course, this is where Blueprints gets to cheat, where board games can't. All of the functionality of this room is kind of in the physical experience of it. And I think this works probably on a third layer, which is the one you're talking about, which is sort of as you progress in the game, suddenly the text that is missing from these rooms starts to become apparent to the player. And there's a lot of hidden functionality of the rooms that allows me to present everything in a simple way. And then over time, an experience as the player learns, then suddenly maybe a fuller picture of what each room actually entails will come together. But that's part of the fun, is because once you start learning that, then every room becomes, the limits of what is in each room suddenly increases with your own imagination of what of the possibilities in the game. And I think that this is a game of possibilities. Each door is a possibility, but then what is in each room is a possibility. And just because, like you said, just because you can't click on things doesn't necessarily mean that the room is limited in its potential in terms of your imagination of possibilities.
Yeah, really fantastic way of putting it. It does. I want to drill deeper into this, because something that I was wondering when I was playing it, as a designer myself, is the game, as we were talking about right now, so much of the actual brilliance of the game for the player and the enjoyment is in the ambiguity, is in your restraint as a designer and even a writer, like the things that you're putting into the game, your restraint, whether it be in a room or the text that's on a card, or, these things, the things that you can interact with. But from a very sort of classical design sense, sometimes the fear there is that, and the consequence of that can be that the affordance of the game and how you interact with it and what you're actually able to do is ambiguous as well, right? So in one way, it's ambiguous, and then it gives you these wonderful possibilities that you can then, project into and discover and experiment with. But on the other end of the spectrum, you kind of don't know what you're doing, or you're stuck, or there's not enough information. How did you balance that? Did you find that was an issue through development, or did people have enough kind of tools and building blocks from what you gave them at the start to navigate that with ease?
I don't think it's balanced. I don't. I think that if you are the type of player that needs to have direction and needs to have a clear set out goal, I think that the game does provide, obviously, the impetus of the game's story and projection is finding a hidden room. So that's a goal, but it's not a very clear one because you don't know where the room is. Now, if you look at the floor plan map, there is something resting on the 9th rank that is visible. One of the floor plans can be seen right away, the antechamber, and that might give a player, something they can make their first assumption. And that's the other thing. We said the game is about possibilities and the player's imagination. That imagination leads to assumptions, and the assumptions are not always correct, but they can still be useful in terms of giving player a goal, even if it's a self-assigned goal, and it's not necessarily something that aligns with what might be productive or not. But even having a goal is obviously pretty useful in terms of giving destinies to players that need destinies. But the truth in terms of the balance is the game is really designed for the inquisitive and the explorative type who will create their own sort of goals and designs within the game, and it is probably aggressively geared toward those type of players. Where I do think that we do leave some people behind who maybe are looking for something more traditional or concrete, but there are thousands of games like that, and I think it when making this, it was really important for me to make something that I've been looking for. And I'm definitely looking for a game that kind of, from the very first moment, puts you into a world without too much explanation or too much hand holding, and lets you figure it out for yourself. For example, I've been playing UFO 50. I've been playing a lot of UFO 50, and I love that they take the same approach of not explaining any of the mechanics up front and sort of gradually learning these simple systems from experimentation. And, it's one of my favorite games of all time because of the way we do that, of the way they did this. And I feel that I took a similar approach, which is the joy of discovery outweighs the immediacy of maybe explaining it to people up front, even at the risk of narrowing maybe your potential audience. But I always consider the game niche. I think the success of it has surprised me more than anyone, because I did not think I was making, let's say, a very accessible game in terms of onboarding, right? It's kind of like start in a room and that, but I think that the critical reaction has been helpful, because it allows people to maybe go past where they maybe initially bounce off because they're like that. But at the same time, it's also set a lot of higher expectations. What the game is trying to subvert your expectations. So if they're really high, it's hard for the game to work in the way it was designed, which is
what a great point.
We'll say even where you're at, I feel like a lot of the assumptions that you'll make at various stages at the game will eventually get played with as the game progresses.
Yeah, we spoke about before we came on to the episode. I mentioned how this is, I'm going to strive to make a spoiler-free episode. Even though Claudio, our producer, was like, this is a development podcast. We can do the spoilers or whatever. And I was like, No, because I realize I don't want the game spoiled for me. I've like, it's, these assumptions that you're talking about that prove to be incorrect at numerous points through the game has just made me hungrier for like figuring out how wrong I am right now. And it's given me this severe clarity of probably the fact that I am incredibly incredibly wrong about where the game is going or my role in it as the player and as Simon. So I'm just having a wonderful, I don't think I've had so much fun having a game prove to me that my assumptions were potentially incorrect or whatever at various points of time. I did want to mention quickly about UFO 50 because I was going to say this to you off the podcast, but now that you've brought it up, John Perry, one of the developers of UFO 50, gave a talk at GDC you may be familiar with, but if not, it's almost exactly what we're talking about right now. So for our listeners too, it's called John Perry, one of the designers and developers of UFO 50, but the talk's called How Tabletop Designed Help Shape UFO 50. And it's on the GDC Vault. It's free. John actually asked for it to not be paywalled. And so thanks to him, anyone can access it and it's free. And he talks about this chunkiness in design and keeping the resources really tight and how it informed, he talks about Party House and Avianos and Bug Hunter, I think, as well. And through the lens of those games that he developed or led the development on for UFO 50, he talks about this kind of chunkiness and how tabletop influenced that and the brilliant outcomes it can have in video game design as well, and kind of provides a bit of literally at one point, a matrix for developers, but, a bunch of philosophies and sort of puts a stake in the ground for this kind of design, spending more of its time in video games. And so no wonder it's one of your of your favorite games as well. You're working on the same design philosophy.
I have not listened to it yet, but I just know from the work that just John Perry's already become one of my absolute favorite designers just based on the work. And I'm not kidding when I say that UFO 50 is probably in my top 4 favorite games of all time. And that's just because, I mean, it's obviously because it's great and fantastic, but it's also because it just happens to align with so much of what I love. So yeah, I have on one second.
He's going to grab something off the shelf. What do we got here?
So I've been loading up on some John Perry.
All of John Perry's games. What do we got? Air, Land, and Sea, Spots, The Barons. Yeah, man. And he also designs those kinds of games that you're talking about that just have a tiny few amount of mechanics and resources and stuff. When we're talking about tabletop games that he makes, right? Like Spots, for example, beautifully simple game.
Yep. So I'm really eager to dive into those. I've just gotten those.
Right.
Because I'm only 3/5 through UFO 50. I'm kind of taking it in the one game a week format, which has worked well, obviously, throughout development. I don't have a lot of time to play games, and I think we might talk about that at some point. But a lot of stuff is because I've kind of been sequestered from a lot of games as I've kind of tried to design in a vacuum, for better or worse. But that's just artistically what's been kind of fun for me to do. And it's kind of led to a lot of interesting things. I think like when you look at some of the similarities and the things people compare the game to, I was not familiar at all with roguelike and roguelike deck builders when I built the game. Like, it was entirely from the board game world, and obviously deck builders in terms of Dominion and Ascension played huge pivotal roles in the inspiration. But the game was designed before 2 years before the Slay the Spire had even been released.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to me, and I never played any of those throughout all the development to try to I guess if we were both coming at it from the same way, because I know that Dominion and Ascension were pretty influential to the Slay the Spire guys. Then I was kind of like, well, I happen to be doing something similar to what they're doing, but I'm gonna at least not look at what their take was, right? So
remain untainted. Exactly.
At least my take will be like how I envision bringing over these mechanics. But I'm so happy that the board game mechanics are finally coming over to games, because for a long time, I mean, I have just thought there was such a rich tapestry, to use, your or John's term of chunkiness. There's just something just absolutely amazing in the simplicity and the resources and the transparency of mechanics. That is just missing from a lot of games, and it's still missing from a lot of games. But every more and more those mechanics are coming on. And obviously, like you have some forerunners like Armello that kind of started pushing bleeding the boundaries, we'll say.
Yeah. I remember having drinks in Chinatown, New York with Zach Gage one night, because I was just in town, but he and I were both in the depths of designing our digital tabletop games. He was making Tharsis and I was making Armello, and we were commiserating on, like, because I think we were coming into release, and it was the challenges of communicating, even though these concepts of tabletop games were quite simple, communicating them in a digital format to players, without being there or having a rule book, and just the actual. I remember at the time there was only 2 or 3 of us or whatever. There was only a couple of games. I mean, Hearthstone was announced during Armello's development, and when we started Armello, I remember the impetus was that the iPad had come out, and we were playing games on our iPad. We were watching Game of Thrones at the time, and we were big board gamers as well. And we were like, all of these board games on the iPad suck. They were just like kind of licensed, they were like Carcassonne or whatever, these big games that were licensed out to like web developers to make some apps or something, or some like, fee for service app developers. And we were like, there is a digital first board game experience here for this platform. And then obviously as we made the game, we realized that it was a PC and console kind of scope too, and Kickstarter was doing its thing. But yeah, that whole idea of, I remember, I'm one of these designers that I always say my greatest sort of admission of guilt is that I'm not a game ideas game designer. I like answer questions. It's almost like an antithesis. There's always got to be some big question that I'm trying to crack. And the one with Armello that got me out of bed every day, that felt bigger than me, was how do you bring a tabletop adventure to life? Like, and that's all every day that we went to work. And so one of the things was like getting birds flying around, because it was like, we're bringing it to life. So not just in the aspect of the mechanics, but in the whole experience, the atmosphere, like with the blueprints and with Myst, the similarities there. This kind of, this forefront, like you're saying, and then folks like yourself have come along and contributed to it. And obviously Bellatrix has done a huge amount in regards to cards and stuff. It's really incredible, just the kind of stranglehold now that tabletop mechanics have on video games. I mean, for a while we were seeing booster packs in like Battlefield and things like that, right? Almost being weaponized for evil, tabletop mechanics. But yeah, it is quite impressive.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, we won't get into that.
And definitely one that saddens me. We'll say that, because I actually think that there's now these huge negative stigmas on mechanics that I think have design space, to explore. And it's like, I can't, it's like, how do you tackle boxes with random stuff now? It's like after so much stigma, it's like, well, obviously I'm a big fan of random things, like, the trunks that you find in each room. Will always have sort of like random things, and part of that is for the varied experience, and part of that is to keep each day on your toes, which leads to these great stories that can emerge in each day, as you find different things and different tools.
That's an interesting thing that I find whenever I speak to folks who are creating video games, and we had this experience. It was something that Zach and I spoke about a lot too, and Soren Johnson and I have this conversation a lot, is this line between determinism that a lot of, especially if you're making like a strategy game that has a board game root or something, right? Strategy gamers who have a video game heritage expect determinism. They lay out a plan, they know the hit points and everything, and they know that if they execute that plan, it should go well. If they execute execute it well. Whereas board gamers, if you grew up playing Talisman or something like that, it's essentially like Snakes and Ladders for adults, right? You very much become a storyteller that embraces the random nature of like the snakes and the ladders or the chutes and the ladders, right? So
Yep.
my question to you is, when designing blueprints and then giving it to people to play test, or even in the responses afterwards, have you found any word of this, like, RNG, or do you feel like people have enough, ability to affect agency and determinism over the systems, or does it feel too random for a certain subset of players that aren't willing to sort of roll with the punches and just reset their day? Or
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I feel like if you look at something like let's say a single player board game experience, like or a cooperative one, I feel like Forbidden Desert is something that has sort of like these different difficulty levels that you can set, and like games like this or Hanabi, I always like to play on like the hardest difficulty. Uh, and so I think that for me, because as soon as I win, that's when I'm done with the game.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of how I approach things, which is like it's the challenge of learning the systems and how to mitigate the randomness and the strategies. And these are games that don't actually have any sort of progressive elements that make it harder. They're relying entirely on your experience and learning like what are the odds if I do this that this will go wrong or right. It's very similar in blueprints when you start getting a feeling of like, when I'm drafting from a northward facing door, how likely am I to get a room that leads straight versus one that turns right or left. And I feel like these things are only learned through playing and learning the game's thing. I think it's a very similar thing if you're playing, a single player or a cooperative board game, where it's like, how likely is this outcome? Like, am I risking something? Maybe like in Armello, like if I'm exploring a tile, like how likely am I going to get a certain outcome? And this experience only comes from playing, right? And learning the patternings of the games. So I think that a lot of the board game crowd will obviously be much more understanding that it takes some time to learn, and then after you have learned the systems, that's when strategies start to emerge, and high levels or lower level strategies. And that's not talking about actual getting progression or meta progression in a game that will make it easier as you go along as well. So I think that we have both of those elements, but probably your experience kind of lends itself a lot to that. And then, but there are certain players that you said that are purely deterministic, and then they come in and they maybe don't understand that the system is not created necessarily. I don't even say to win, because I never even thought of it as winning or losing on a day. It's just how much can you get done in the day, and then the day is over and you go on to your next day. And maybe it was perhaps the rise of these other games that are much more binary and success or failure. That mentality has kind of been patterned, and that we don't really play maybe in the same pattern, but people want to assign the pattern of failure and success to something. And I'm not saying they're incorrect, but that's certainly not the way I saw it necessarily. It was more of like, how much can I get done in this day and how much can I learn? And if you only see 8 rooms in a day, what can you get done in that 8 rooms? And maybe can you use strategy to maybe see a couple more rooms, right? Like even though like this day doesn't necessarily look like it's going to be a big house, but I thought the variety was cool, that some days you're dealing with like a lot of rooms and a lot of cards, but I wouldn't even want it to be a game where necessarily you could fill up your house every single day, because then you don't have like these sort of unique days that cause you to pivot in other directions and things.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's definitely interesting. It's interesting to see different people's sort of impression or the assumptions that they are making about the game and the goal that you have.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny. The thing that resonated with me as well from a lot of the wonderful things you were saying there is also this notion of the players not being wrong. I know that was something that I really struggled with, when Mellow first came out, because I was just so clearly and like completely in the camp of, and still am to this day, of video game players that are completely fine with failure. And like it becomes a part of the narrative of play for me, and I don't get tech rage or anything like that for whatever reason. And I we were experiencing plays, especially at the start of the game, because Armello's greatest crime is the admission here on my hand is I didn't even know about the terms input versus output randomness as a game designer back in 2011 when we started designing. I don't even know if people were talking about input and output randomness back in 2011 when we were designing Armello, but like we definitely were way heavier on the output randomness. So you do something and it has a random outcome that's good or bad or a spectrum in between. Typically players don't like that a lot of the time. They prefer input randomness, which is obviously the drafting of rooms, right? You go to a door, you get a random choice, and then you decide what to do, or a random selection, you decide what to do with it, right? It gives you that agency after the randomness. But this notion that players, after they engaged with Armello, were like, all of these things happened to me and it was bad and I had a bad time. My response immediately was like, you're playing the game. That's the wrong way to approach the game. Like it's not bad. It was just a different story for your hero, because we had also designed Armello as this kind of story generator, for each run or each game that you play. But because we did 7 years of live service on Armello. And I remember after the first couple of years, it took me a little bit of time as a young, stubborn game designer, but realizing that like, no, there's really, and this isn't some profound realization, but that there are people who are going to come to this experience and have with a completely different perspective on what they want from a gameplay experience and what they expect, whether it be from their life or through their frame of reference playing video games. And so the latter half, I would say, of Armello's live service development was actually shaving the edges off a lot of things that probably could have used it. A lot of that random outcomes. We throttled some of the like more the spikes of the randomness and stuff, which just didn't bring down the actual quality of the experience, but made it more palatable for those folks who, it wasn't the right sort of game for them. Interesting. Yeah, we even put an RNG disclaimer on the store page that said the game is filled with it. Like, come here, buyer beware, enter at your own risk.
I do think that is the opposite thing. And it's very funny for me because I'm dealing with two sides, which is the puzzle side as a puzzle game. And I feel like the combination has solved a lot of things that were also kind of difficult in puzzle games, which is that you would either have to make such a frictionless puzzle experience, which is like in a linear puzzle game, right? If you hit a puzzle you can't solve, you're not going to be able to progress. And so the solution often is to make a frictionless puzzle system, and not to say I can't enjoy some of those when they're bringing other things to the table like atmosphere or mood. But it's very clear when the game is sort of guiding your hand in such an easy way to solving puzzles. And that's not the type of puzzles I enjoy. I enjoy things that make you think, maybe things that you can't solve right away and ponder for a very long time. It took me an entire year to beat Myst and a second year to beat Riven because I refused to look anything up and I would just be stuck on something for a very long time. But I enjoyed that because it kind of got to occupy my thoughts. And I love games that allow you to sort of work on a problem outside of just playing them. And I feel like there's a lot of puzzle games where your pieces might be so specific that it'd be impossible to solve it outside of the screen, because this is like a sliding tile puzzle where it's like I have to tangibly work on this while playing this, and maybe something more numerically driven like a Sudoku might be something that you can only solve while tangibly there, while some cool like word puzzles and things are things that you could or something environmentally based can be something you can think about while away from the computer screen. And so a lot of those years with Riven, was thinking about the way the world works and eventually coming up with theories that would then get you to want to play it when you got back home. Maybe I'd be thinking about this all day at school, and then eventually go back and do this. And it took a year of this process for me to get through this. But I think that kind of betrays how patient I am as a player, where most people would look this up and sort of progress that line. But I do think that in general, people are so concerned about maybe the audience reaction that they have been, sort of like making the puzzles easier to try to prevent those sort of feel bad negative experiences that certain players might have. But like that's kind of like my unapologetically, I made this for myself. This is the type of puzzle game I wanted to play, and maybe on a very similar way with the board game mechanics, kind of not necessarily curving off all the edges. And hopefully, I think there was a lot of intention in the way the game progresses that will the game self-administers a rounding polish of its own to make things easier, both as you discover things and you maybe unlock things that start maybe becoming giving players more agency, and especially the ones that might be struggling with the premise, we'll say.
Yeah, I've definitely been rewarded for restraining myself from looking things up or whatever by, 2 or 3 runs later, it then reveals itself. Or maybe even like a few rooms later, something's drafted in and I discover something. I'm like, oh, okay. And that all of a sudden that room or that contraption or whatever it might be that had no meaning whatsoever or was a complete mystery to me and complete black box, all of a sudden was, filled with meaning and context and affordance. Like we were talking about.
And I hope players find that out soon, because I think that's one of the first good lessons that you can learn in the game is, there are actual other clues in other parts of this game. So it's not necessarily like a escape room where I'm presented with a thing and the solution should be transparent to me. And if I can't figure it out, it is a failing of my own intellect, right? That's obviously a scary thing to approach, because then you're left with that binary success or failure at first encounter of a puzzle. So I think one of the big things was that the game just can't function like that ever for a player, so that they can learn very quickly that this doesn't necessarily work in quite the same way that other puzzle games work, right? This is just going to be much more of something that you're going to find over time. And I think that, and I would definitely urge people to not look things up, because I think that if you look up a lot of things, you're going to think the answer is ridiculous, because how could I ever come up with that? But, probably a lot of these guides are just giving you the answer and not explaining, this was actually something that you were supposed to gradually understand over the course of like 20 days. And finding all these
5 different rooms and all of this sort of stuff.
And then suddenly this image slowly coalesces in your mind that allows you at any point in that journey to come up with the solution yourself, because we don't know at what point in that journey each individual player will have their eureka moment that leads them to the solution. But there is a trail sort of winding through the tapestry of the game that will eventually lead you to that point. But, for some people that might be, immediate. And for some people that might be much later in the game. But the way the game is structured, it's perfectly fine if you don't figure this out for 30, 40 days. Like it's not going to impede your progress in any sort of definitive way. Obviously, if you figure stuff out, you might be able to progress further along that route, but there are many alternate routes, and there's no one route in the game which is mandatory in order to progress.
That actually brings about a question, which is, during playtesting, did you find that there was a kind of consistency here in regards to when realizations were hitting players and in what order, or was it a chaotic mess and of like when they discovered the 46th room, or that this thing was happening, or that the functionality of this room was actually this and it can do this, et cetera, et cetera. All those realizations that you have throughout the game, was it a chaotic sort of organic mess and it varied and that was fine? Or was it a chaotic mess and you had to put in some sort of, some manual intervention to ensure that they were better spaced apart? Or talk to me about that process of actually ensuring the players got things.
I wanted a variety of experience. So I think that it was really I would consider it obviously like a success when I was seeing people solve them at various points. So it was more of for the playtesting, it was more making sure everyone eventually gets there. The caveat being that they continue playing. So I think that, the game is kind of designed so that like people will play it, for as long as they want. And I think I've always seen it more as a board game in that sense, that this is a board game that has a lot of secrets and a lot of things that you can discover. So, it has a lot of replayability as a board game. And obviously there's a narrative through line that's kind of separate from this access. But in that access is like, play it until you feel like you've gotten enough out of the board game itself. And I think that so the main thing in terms of playtesting was just ensuring that you would eventually come to that realization, even if it was drastically different from the point of game that the majority of other playtesters had reached that thing. So if they were never getting at that point, then I would either consider, is this necessary to reach ever? Can this be bypassed completely? And or, do I need to put in another sort of element that will eventually lead them here? I wouldn't even say necessarily something as definitive as a clue. I feel like a clue with a capital C, we'll say, is something that can be maybe overtly loud. And there are definitely several of those positioned, but there are a lot of intangible ways in terms of letting people think in a certain way. Maybe you frame something else in the game that gets them thinking in a sort of like lateral way.
Give
that
them a
aligns
path to go down.
Well, just aligns with the way that another puzzle can be solved, right? Even if you're not giving an explicit hint for that, you're showing the general structure of thinking that if they apply it to this other problem, they'll get there well. And that's my favorite type of clue, because that's not an actual direct clue to this puzzle, but it helps people to be able to speak the language of the game.
It also gives the player the brilliant opportunity to feel like they've had the realization themselves, as opposed to just reading a clue, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think that there's a mix of both, and in terms of speaking the language of the game, there's also several languages that the game is speaking. So you can't even necessarily, that's kind of the assumptions. You can't understand the puzzle structure. And even see a couple of these puzzle structures, you might start to see a pattern and be like, okay, I think I can solve the puzzles in this game because I can kind of see the language of the game. That's not necessarily going to always serve you well as things progress, because I like variety, and I like things that kind of maybe play on your expectations in both the mechanics and the types of puzzles, which leads to having a grand variety that lets me explore a lot of different things that I felt interesting.
And it feels like there's a lot in there, truly, Tonda. Now, as we're sort of coming towards, the end of the episode here, it would be absolutely amiss of me to not talk about the atmosphere and the aesthetics of Blueprints as well. It's very striking, I guess is the word. And from the moment you're in it, you feel the presence of of the estate, right? And that this it has a real sense of place about it, and even the I don't know if it was a selection of the art style, your direction that you've gone down for the art direction and the art style, is it all, and the music and everything. It's so wonderfully cohesive, all of it. And so I'm interested to hear down a couple of, we can talk a little bit about the music and the ambience, but I want to start with the art style. Sort of, how did you arrive? I mean, we've spoken about you as a filmmaker and writing and board games and everything, but there seems to be some great artistic talent here as well, right? That,
yes.
So tell me about the art.
It's not all mine.
Great. Okay, good.
Yeah,
all right. Yeah. We were building you up there. That's
yeah. So when I was first messing around in Unity, part of the reason I was able to build that sort of first prototype build of the game was because I did not learn any, I wasn't dabbling in any 3D modeling or learning about shaders or materials or anything. So that was just possible because Unity Asset Store. So I was able to just download, furniture a la carte. And I was just like, okay, this is amazing. And so I was able to prototype that entire game through a combination of very rudimentary, primitive, 3D cubes, which that's how I made my rooms, right? Every room was just a collection of 3D cubes that I put into a prefab and then put in these sort of store-bought assets into it. And so the first year was kind of building up that. And I did not know, I did not think I was going to have to replace all those stock assets. I think I was like, okay, this is just given my own experiences and my own talents, I'm going to use stock assets. What I did think was I was going to retexture them. So I was going to take sort of stock models and then come up with my own textures to try to create a semi-cohesive art style. Because obviously anyone who has bought assets knows that they're all different artists, they're all different styles, their shaders are completely incompatible with each other, and you're just going to end up looking like a complete mess. So at the very least, I was like, okay, I'm probably going to create my own shader and maybe retexture and try to figure that out. I also knew that I couldn't just use all stock furniture or stock materials. I would need some bespoke things in the game, obviously, and probably quite a lot. So I started looking for a 3D modeler. And in the process, I came across the portfolio of Davide Polino, who is an Italian 3D artist that works in Blender. And his portfolio was amazing because he was messing around with sort of 3D models that looked like they were hand sketched in terms of their outlines and things. They had an imperfection of the line work. It really looked like sketch work, and he had these cities, that would be like a small, like a village or a town, and each building, like the lines would be, like not like super, not aggressively stylized, but very imperfect in the way the lines were drawn. And of course those lines were that was done with a post-processing things, which obviously we ended up using actual physical meshes for all our outlines, but they were not they were not generated. We did hand meshes so that we could individually move the vertex of outlines so that the thickness could be imperfect, and then combining it with the elements of that. So that was when I found his work. That's when I shifted from, I'm no longer looking for a 3D artist. I would love to offer him to be the art director of the game. And so I offered him art director of the game. And that's when at about a year and a half into the production, I deleted the entire project.
Right. Time to start again. Yeah.
Everything was done. Not just all the models, but all the codes too. Because at this point, I now feel like I'm a year and a half in. So I now understand sort of sort of the goals and the structures of the game, and it's so much easier to lay the bedrock of your sort of planning and your code when you know everything you want to accomplish in the game, right? Because when I first started, everything's just being added additively, and so that was a perfect opportunity. So the idea was to sort of then we scrapped everything, and then we wanted to just build every piece of furniture sort of by hand from scratch to kind of establish a new cohesive style to everything. And I think that we had thought that process would take about 6 months to catch back up to where we were. But obviously in total, I think it took 2 years. So it took even longer than it originally had taken to reach that point.
Yeah. And so where did let's talk about the music for a little bit here. It would just be amiss of us not to, and the ambiance of the game in regards to the sound design. Where did the music come along? I imagine the music is not you as well, right? The music is someone else. Yeah. How did that come about?
It's so funny because typically, and when I make films, I'm the type of person who likes to do the score first. Right. And so to get all the music first, and that way I can listen to the music as I'm planning my shots and stuff. I don't like to send like the edit to the composer, because then they just have to like forcefully like create their composition to match with all the timings. I would much rather cut to the music. However, in Blueprints, I didn't actually find the composer until the very last 2 years. So it was actually 2024, maybe the beginning of 2024, or no, 2023 probably, when I found Trig and Gusset. And they are kind of like a dark doom jazz duo. And they kind of deal in atmospheric ambient spaces. And just the first time I heard their music, I was like, oh, they're a perfect fit. And they were actually the very first people I ever reached out to in terms of doing the score. And they were down, and we talked, and they just started doing it. And eventually it was like, oh, this is perfect. And so the music was actually one of the very last elements to come into play.
There's also an interesting thing too, which funnily enough, Eric, on the UFO 50 team talks about, is he, even as a composer on the games, he really likes the constraint or the restraint to actually not have music in a lot of his games. And there is moments in the Blueprints where I'm just loving the music, and I'm there, and I'll realize that it's happening, and that like what the reason why I'm feeling a particular way is because it's this incredible track that's playing, really, sort of amplifying my experience and my emotions as I'm playing. And then there's long stints where I don't even realize that there has been no music playing whatsoever. So was that a conscious decision as well, to give a bunch of space throughout and not have the music?
I think it's really cool, because I know exactly what you're talking about, because obviously, like, it's so funny that he's the musical side, and then Barbuda and Divers are both like this very very things. Yeah, for me, I think it comes down to my idea of atmosphere, and for me, atmosphere can entail music, but a lot of times it's kind of established the way a room sounds. So the hum of a lamp, or the mechanics of a ceiling fan, right? And I think it's kind of like being in a space and kind of like hearing the wind, the wind underneath a door causing like a draft, And I think that these sounds of a house are kind of like, they're cool. They kind of build up a character, and they're kind of unsettling and kind of add to the overall ambience and atmosphere of a space. So I would not want a game to be entirely music driven at all times, because I think that the restraint for me has more to do with wanting to have a little bit of that sound design, and maybe that comes from film, but it's kind of letting that have its own play. Now, as a bonus, the music gets to be even more powerful, and these moments get to be even more impactful because you withheld the music. But I wouldn't say that was the overall intention. That's just a happy bonus that then happens, that when the music does come in, it gets to be, thrice as strong in terms of these moments because we don't use it constantly.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a dear friend, Emily Ridgway, who's an audio director, among other things, at Valve. She was the audio director on BioShock. And I remember her talking to me once about this moment that she had playing World of Warcraft years ago as an audio designer too, playing it and thinking about it in that way. And she was like, every time I was getting ganked by some other player and I was on the edge of my seat, my heart was in my throat, and the music was like really right there. It wasn't because the combat track kicked in or anything. It was just because those moments happened to serendipitously come together. And it really influenced the way that she approached audio direction moving forward from that moment, because she had less of a heavy hand or wanting to order things, and just letting the interactivity and the infinite possibilities that happen within context and everything give you those moments where the composition and the gameplay and the contextual situation just beautifully dovetail into each other and aren't forced and manicured every particular type of way.
And I think relying on serendipity, that's like a perfect way to describe Blueprints, because the entire game is relying on serendipity to create these moments from day to day. And it never ceases to amaze me, because I think, like we touched on, creating stories within days and these strategies that emerge and these moments that emerge. It's what makes watching the game, even as a viewer, seeing me watching a playtester, or now I'm able to watch, streamers play. And it's what makes all these moments really special is the serendipity. And that these moments that will never be recreated again, that only exist within this person's day.
What a beautiful place to wrap up the episode. Tonda, thank you so much. I actually feel like there was a ton of serendipity in this conversation as well, in regards to our tabletop influences, our love of UFO 50, the way in which I've experienced Blueprints mirroring so much of what you've seen. Congratulations on your success critically, culturally, commercially. It's a very special thing. And also for, since you were saying 2016, 2017, this journey that you've been on, finally making it to at least one of the finish lines, So congratulations.
Yeah. I'm, it's been a long journey. So
yeah.
I'm
What's
happy
next?
to
Do you
finally
have
get
any
there.
sort of plans to, this isn't the Hot Scoops podcast, so you're not beholden to drop any bombs on us, but like, do you have any hopes for the game in regards to updates, or is it this finished masterpiece that you're happy with and you're focusing on other things?
I will admit, in the last year, I had a couple of things I had to finish in the game, and I did not quite get everything into the game that I had hoped. I likely could have, but I chose to try to polish and work on the stability of everything over getting in the last few elements. Funny enough, one of the last few elements is like a retro arcade game, like
the Digitron, right?
8-bit era Dirigible blocks. That was something that was probably like 70% complete, but I am committed. Obviously, the game itself is committed to getting some of these elements in. So there will be one big update that kind of finishes my vision and gives the complete game, which has, there'll probably be an opportunity to tweak some balancing and a few things. But I'm not looking to continually add to the game. So there will not be any major DLC or anything like that. There will be a substantial update at some point in the future, as soon as I fix all the bugs that need to get fixed before I can continue to work on content. But it will not be a substantial amount of content. It will just be a final update that will kind of wrap things up.
Well, I'm very excited to play Digibox in coming months when I draft up the commissary. So,
all right, don't hype it up too much. I was like, I don't want
we'll get you on another episode for the Digibox.
Well, it's like after I played UFO 50, I was like, oh no, like someone just absolutely murdered this concept 50 times.
All right. Well, thank you, Tonda. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. You too. Thanks so much.
Cheers.